Hello, my name is Lindsey Nangle, and my research project measured the effects of social pressures on conformity. So what causes conformity? This was the main question we were asking, and in this case, it was social pressures. More importantly, we were asking, would people conform under social pressures? Other factors related to this were the person's level of self-esteem and their personality type, because in the past, low levels of self-esteem have correlated with conformity, and so have agreeable and neurotic personality types. There are a few ideas from past literature that explain why individuals conform. Festinger proposed the idea of social comparison in 1954. By definition, social comparison is when people are uncertain about the legitimacy of their own opinions, so they look to others for guidance as to what the correct response would be. And this consists of upward and downward social comparison, which I will talk about later. He also introduced the cultural evolution theory, which basically states if our ideas are not good enough to learn from someone else's. Ash proposed how social pressures can alter decision making, and one of these aspects were compliance. Now, compliance is just one aspect of conformity, and it could possibly help us understand why people conform. Compliance is conforming based on the desire to be accepted by others, so this could even go into more of the person's self-esteem level. And then there's private and public acceptance that Ash also introduced, where individuals conform because they believe that the opinions of others are more correct or more informed than their own. Both of them, Festinger and Ash, actually mentioned political opinions specifically and how complex they are and how they're conditioned by a person's personal nature and how they were raised, how they grew up, what they were surrounded by, and because of all of these aspects, political opinions are not easily changed sometimes, and I thought it was important to touch on that because political opinions are the basis of my research experiment here. So, a study done by Pennsylvania State University students was the model that I used to conduct my own research. Their experiment was a discussion-based experiment to measure conformity. Their topic was the firing of Penn State football coach for charges against him of child sexual abuse. Now, my topic was socialism versus capitalism, so it was different in that aspect, but they're both political topics. They also had a pre-test, test, and post-test condition, so that is one of the main ways I modeled their study. My hypothesis was that social pressures would have a significant effect on conformity. I also hypothesized that low self-esteem levels would positively correlate with conformity, and so would neurotic and agreeable personality types. My participants consisted of college-age students, ages ranging from 18 to 23, 37.5% males and 62.5% females, and there were 24 participants total, so not a huge sample. The materials I used were an online survey, Rosenberg's self-esteem scale, and the 10-item personality inventory. My online survey consisted of an informed consent form, then general opinions on political issue, which were 7 statements on socialist versus capitalist principles, and the participant would rate on a Likert scale from 0 to 4 how much they agreed or disagreed with the statement. Some of the statements were like, you favor the idea of creating a universal healthcare system in America, or socialism takes away too many individual rights, or socialism is a way to make things fair for working people. There were 7 of those statements, and then they took Rosenberg's self-esteem scale, 10-item personality inventory, demographic questions, and there was a thank you page at the end. So for the procedures, first, I would recruit a participant or they would reach out to me. I would receive their initial responses on those 7 statements at the time of scheduling. So we would schedule this meeting. I would have their initial responses, And before we met for the live interaction, I would tell my Confederates their responses, and the Confederates were to answer the opposite of the participants' responses. So they were voluntarily placed in this setting where they faced unified opposition to their expressed opinion by volunteering Confederates. 3 of them would be present. They would answer first and then the participant, in hopes that the participant, after hearing the Confederates, would maybe change their mind or alter their response in some way. The political topic, of course, was socialist versus capitalist principles. Then we would assess their opinion again in the presence of the Confederates and I. And then they would take my online survey. And this, of course, is a within subjects design because all participants received each level of the independent variable. So to further reiterate the 3 conditions, I just want to make this a little more clear. All 3 conditions consisted of the same questions, the 7 statements. Tests were completed in this order. First, the pretest condition, where responses were given privately at the time of scheduling. Next, there was the test condition, where responses were made publicly in front of the Confederates and I. And lastly, the post-test condition, where responses were made privately, and this would be via the online survey. So what we were really looking for is a significant change in the test condition because it is the one where responses were made publicly. This would ultimately suggest that conformity did take place. I conducted a repeated measures analysis of variance to analyze the difference in the pretest, test, and post-test responses. The results confirmed the first hypothesis, yielding a main effect for conformity, such that the average was significantly higher for the test condition than the pretest and post-test conditions. There was also a gender interaction effect that was found to be significant. I wasn't intending on measuring this, but it was significant and it made a big difference. The mean difference between males and females was 1.22, females having higher rates of conformity. And this kind of shows where that fell. It was hypothesized that low self-esteem levels and agreeable or neurotic personality types would correlate with conformity. However, there was no significant effect found for those, and I listed the p-values here. Because we saw a relatively intense change between the pretest condition and the test condition, we can conclude that conformity did take place. Next, there was a significant interaction, and the relationship between self-esteem, personality type, and conformity was not significant. There are a few extraneous variables to take note of that could have taken place. Situational variables could be any environmental factor. That could be literally anything going on in the room that could distract or alter someone's response. Then there could be individual differences like their mood, intelligence level, nerves, etc. that could play a part. And experimenter bias or demand characteristics, which I think my Confederates and I both did a pretty good job of staying away from, which would be unintentionally giving clues to participants about the purpose of the research. An example of this could have been if one of my participants overheard the Confederates discussing what they were going to answer during the test condition. So a few main concepts. Findings did have important implications for research on social behavior. It is not about the participant's opinion, but rather their change in opinion in the presence of others that we were looking for. And real-life group settings are the most efficient way to measure conformity. So my conclusions based on my specific experiment, the results confirmed the first hypothesis, yielding a main effect for conformity, such that the average number found across the test condition was significantly higher than the pretest and post-test conditions. My hypothesis that self-esteem and personality type would have a significant effect on conformity was incorrect, showing no main effect. And lastly, in addition to the main effects of social pressure and conformity, the study also examined the interaction between conformity and gender. Gender's interaction effect was significant. and there are the stats for that. So to relate my conclusions to past literature, the Penn State study that I used as my model, 62% of their participants ended up conforming in the presence of others. Ash's study back in 1951 with the line, 74% of his participants conformed as well. Upward or downward social comparison occurs when people compare themselves to someone they perceive to be either superior or inferior to them, and then they base their response off of that. So that was definitely played a role in this research. And lastly, gender studies show that women are more likely to conform under social pressures than men, and my findings support that very much. And these are my references. Thank you.